All right.
Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. This is part two of our discussion of Platonic dialogues. Today's episode will be about the apology. One thing that I think would be helpful is to sort of put this into context. What's the why and the when and the where? So in 399, Socrates is tried for corrupting the youth and disbelieving in the gods. Now, if you read Plato's Apology, the claim seems pretty flimsy. The claims made against Socrates don't really seem to add up to anything serious, and we'll get to that in the apology. But the historical context for this is about 4 years. Okay, in 405 BC, the Athenians lost the Peloponnesian War and Athens was occupied by Sparta, and they installed the 30 tyrants to rule the city until they were expelled and then democracy was restored. Now, also that coupled with the shenanigans of Alcibiades, who basically defected to Sparta and stole state secrets to them during the war, uh, were the ultimate charges for corrupting the youth. Because if we read this, when we get to the symposium, we'll realize that Alcibiades was Socrates' lover, in which case, having such a prominent figure betraying Athens first to Sparta and then to Persia uh, is going to definitely hurt Socrates. And then Critias, who has a dialogue named after him, was the leader of the 30 tyrants who Aristotle in his Athenian Constitution records led a reign of terror which killed 1,500 Athenians through prescriptions. So the two people that were really in mind with the corrupting of the youth were Critias and the other tyrants, as well as Alcibiades. Now, of course, Plato is writing a defense of Socrates. He wants to make the best case he can, so he doesn't really get into that, because again, if you just read the apology, it seems fairly flippant. What is this charge about? At one point, Socrates gets the jury to say, well, everybody makes Athenian children better except Socrates, which is just a self-serving accusation. So part of that is there was this idea that the students of Socrates were traitors to the Athenian state. And it escapes me at the moment, but there was a dialogue where he deals with sophists. And one of the sophists says to Socrates, well, you can't hold me accountable for my students for what they do after what I told them, because I'm not responsible for what they do. And Socrates says, no, 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 you are responsible. Plato says, no, 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 you are responsible for what your students do. And I find it interesting that Plato, while he holds the sophist's feet to the fire in that dialogue, will then say, well, actually, it doesn't matter what Alcibiades or Critias did. It's not Socrates' fault. So that's a little interesting, but that's just the historical context for the apology itself. Andrew or Logos, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I was just going to ask, were Credo and Alcibiades students of Socrates, or were they like contemporaries of Socrates? What was the relationship there?
Well, okay, so Alcibiades was his lover, as we read in
Right.
the symposium. So they're pretty close in that regard. And Critias was one of the young men of Athens that flocked around him to hear his teachings and all that.
I see. Yeah, that does seem a really weird position for Plato to take then.
That's just adding context to this. Now, the point of the apology is to make a case for a specific kind of philosophy where Socrates is the vehicle. So at the beginning of the apology, Socrates is in a position that is strangely relevant in light of cancel culture. He's talking about how the poets and the great men of the city have slandered his name, and he can't really get an honest or fair hearing. Everybody hates him because they've already been prejudged. In fact, Aristophanes, the comic poet Aristophanes, his play The Clouds, is mentioned directly, where in The Clouds, Socrates is accused of just being this goofy guy with his head in the clouds. And it's funny. One of the things we'll see with these dialogues again and again is how contemporary they feel. They feel like these are events that could have happened today. And at the beginning, we see that Socrates is trying to demonstrate that the two charges against him, that of corrupting the youth and that of impiety to the gods, are not based on any real claim. And the main point of with his impiety to the gods is he's like, look, I have a friend, Caraphon, he went to the the Delphic oracle, and asked who's the wisest man, and they said Socrates. Socrates is like, wow, wow, it's me. Why is that? And he eventually comes to the conclusion that it's because he knows nothing. Because there's this line in the dialogue where he says, "Those men in Athens who were considered wise, I investigated and found them to not be so, and those men in Athens who were considered to be unwise turned out to be the wise ones." And by making the wise ones look foolish in public, he ended up getting hated by the powerful. And just as an aside, referring back to my college years, that's exactly what would happen, because I did basically what Socrates did, and it didn't turn out so great. But I mean, this is where I sort of agree with the underlying spirit of Plato's point, that you have to hold accountable your leaders. You have to point out where their flaws, and are they even qualified to have those positions? Because as Socrates ultimately comes to, he says, I'm the gadfly that keeps you guys honest. Those in power, the philosopher's goal is to hold the feet of the people in power to fire, to make sure that they're honest and not BSing you. Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll play a little bit of devil's advocate here, right? That if we steelman the position of the Athenian court a little bit, one of the points that they kind of make, right, and it's debatable whether Socrates did this or not, is that just going around deconstructing things and confusing people is not conducive to a well-ordered society, right? And that I think is probably the strongest case that they could have made or articulated. It's debatable whether that happened with Socrates himself, or if he just wants to get things nailed down and is clearing away the bullshit, so to speak. But I think that's an interesting point too, right? Is that, and we see this especially with the academy nowadays, that there's sort of an emphasis on deconstruction to the point of destroying everything. Not just to get rid of the garbage, but to deconstruct everything. And the one of the issues with like Socratic questioning is that it can be used to do that by an agent that isn't highly ethical. And that gets touched on here too. And I'd like to hear both your and Logos's thoughts on that as well.
One more thing to add as well is tying into that claim of deconstructionism for the sake of deconstructionism. One of the concerns of the Athenian assembly prior to the rule of the 30 tyrants was that Socrates was a secret Spartophile. And the fact that Alcibiades defected to Sparta, and the fact that the 30 tyrants collaborated with Sparta would seem to validate that. And also, when we get to the Republic, we'll see that a lot of the ideals of the Republic are inspired by real-world examples in Sparta itself. But with this sort of, now this is an interesting question you bring up, though, Andrew. Was Socrates purely deconstructionist? Because then this gets into the question of, in Plato's dialogues, where does Socrates end and Plato begin? Because what makes the Republic different than a lot of other dialogues is there is a normative goal or end that Socrates is directing all the interlocutors to. So depending on how we want to read Socrates in that dialogue, we could argue that he is clearing out the rubbish in public life in Athens in order to build the groundwork for the philosopher kings. But Logos, what are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, one of my thoughts on this too is maybe it is debatable whether Socrates was just a pure deconstructionist or not. But I don't think what is debatable, or I don't think it is debatable, that you had a lot of young, impressionable, rich teenagers following him around and watching him. Now, teenagers, by their nature, already have tendencies to be deconstructive and push the rules and so on and so forth. And if they're in a rebellious streak and not thinking of the wider ethics because they're teenagers, if an unethical person can deconstruct things to the point of madness, imagine all these little rich teenagers, flocking around Socrates, seeing him deconstruct some famous politician or something. They go out and mimic what Socrates is doing to their fathers or to whoever. And it's not just one Socrates. Maybe even if Socrates was doing it ethically and meant perfectly well doing so, you have like 30 mini Socrates that aren't quite doing it properly, running around and wreaking all kinds of havoc, you know? And it's just like, what are you going to make of that? So even if Socrates did nothing wrong, could the Athenians have been setting an example?
Yeah, exactly. The other thing that comes up, which is interesting, is Socrates is accused of being like the sophists, and Socrates, in his defense, basically says, "Look, I don't ask for money, uh, and I don't. I believe in the truth, right? Because basically, the sophist, I think it's in the Gorgias when I read it in college, that there's a sophist that argues both sides of an argument equally well, to the point of creating a kind of moral relativism, and that's corrosive to any sort of status quo ante. And Socrates doesn't do that. He doesn't argue two sides of a point equally well. He just tries to demonstrate that you don't know what you're talking about, which in one sense can feel like a sophist, and you can see why the Athenian assembly might lump him in with the sophists. But what Plato's saying in this dialogue is that, well, one, he doesn't charge money, which sophists want money for their services. And furthermore, they claim to know something, whereas Socrates claims to not know something. And that's why he's not a sophist, even though on a superficial level you might think he is. Andrew, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the distinction I tend to make between philosophers and sophists is philosophers have a primary duty to wisdom um, that sort of guides their actions, while sophists just want to win, basically. And this ties into like being able to argue every side of an argument and things like that. And the other thing that I think is important while analyzing this is basically for a layman or someone who is not a philosopher, it's almost impossible to tell a sophist from a philosopher, except maybe by like an analysis of the virtue of their lives, right? And I think that's one of the key points that Socrates is basically making is you can't really tell if I'm a sophist or a philosopher based on hearing my arguments. You have to look at the fact that I don't charge, right? And I think that's a key thing, and something that we run into in modern times too, right? That Athens had a articulate class, a class of people that were very articulate, but they were using that linguistic articulation to basically dominate people tyrannically in various ways. And we've run into the same thing with our academy or people that are very articulate, and they dominate not because they have a first loyalty to wisdom or the truth, but because they have the skills and are able to win at it.
Right. Logos, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, a good example of what Andrew's talking about would be the current debate on so-called critical race theory. Um, you know, conservatives that aren't really into the academy and stuff like that get a lot wrong on calling certain things done in the classroom critical race theory because, critical race theory is some praxis and legal theory and it's college stuff. Ben Shapiro does a decently good summary of it. But the point is, instead of looking at what these people are calling critical race theory, things like, putting kids into groups, oppressor and oppressed, and certain homework assignments and stuff, instead of looking at that and saying this is a catch-all term for a very broad problem these people are talking about, what they do is they do this little gotcha where it's just like, well, this are the technical aspects of critical race theory, and they are nowhere to be found in the K through 12 curriculum or whatever. And they try to win on the technical vocabulary gotcha of the thing rather than the spirit of the point of the thing, which is a question of like, what should we be teaching our kids?
Yeah. I think another thing that's interesting here is to a lot of times, especially from a classical Christian perspective, with the integration of Greek philosophy into a broader curricula, it's interesting, I think, to compare Socrates, who is kind of seen as a prophet for the pagans, how he differs from the Israelite prophets. So Socrates basically says, you should listen to me because I know that I know nothing and neither do you. Whereas the prophets say you should listen to us because we know what God wants and because he told us. Now, Socrates also makes an appeal to divine guidance, i.e., the Oracle of Delphi. But the guidance isn't saying that, okay, this is the truth I want you to propagate, Socrates, to everybody else. It's not some like descriptive, prescriptive moral code. It's this idea that, well, we need to, question people to get to the truth. And we also see that, much like the prophets of the Old Testament, Socrates meets a violent and brutal end. So you can see why like medieval Catholics or like certain Christian classical educators would view Socrates as a sort of proto Christ figure. Even I think it was in the Republic where they said that a perfectly just man would be executed, and a lot of people say, "Oh, doesn't that sound like Jesus?" And so, while there is some similarities, there's also some differences, some important differences, such that I think that should be kept in mind because those differences are sometimes muted in order to make that broader point. Andrew.
Yeah, I guess the key thing that I would notice is that like Socrates was basically offered the opportunity to sort of escape, right? They basically gave him like something absurd, like 30 days notice that we're going to try you, and if you're found guilty, you'll be executed. And oh, by the way, we're not going to arrest you or worry about where you are. So if you just want to, leave in the next 30 days, that would be great because we wouldn't have to have a trial. It's sort of the subtext. And Socrates says something really interesting. He says that his sort of guardian spirit told him that this is not the thing to do, right? And I feel like a good way to look at it and is like the prophets of the Hebrew people through the covenant of Abraham got like a special revelation and really articulate things from God directly, and that Socrates is almost a good way to look at it is like almost a prophet who is working on general revelation alone, right? And I mean, there are some ways that he is like a prophet, but there are some ways where he's just like someone who's really attuned to the sort of underlying ethical world as revealed in nature. And I think that that's sort of the interesting thing is that probably the key thing that relates to it is this martyrdom that he takes on for his reliance on the truth, right? Which I think is analogous to a prophet's martyrdom for God, right? But the actual details and like the context and things are very different because he's not under a covenant at all.
Yeah, Logos, anything you want to add?
Oh, sorry, headset was muted. Definitely. One extra thing to note here on top of what Andrew is saying is I think this is really relevant to how the apology ends, where Socrates basically says, like, okay, I'm gonna die. Now here's a couple ways we can look at the afterlife. So a prophet would kind of know in a sense, or at least strongly believe, depending on if they're of different religion or so on, that they're going to be with God when they die. Socrates didn't seem to be under much illusion that was where he was going. He basically said, well, death could be sleep, in which case, okay, no hard feelings when I die. I'm going to live the way I want to live, and if I just go to sleep sooner than later, so be it. But then he also said basically that, death could be, we could have an afterlife tuned to us in some way based on how we die. And if how we die as a moral person, relates to that, then it might be really, really important to make sure we go out the right way. That's a lot different than prophets or even like Jesus. Jesus said, I'm going to prepare a place for you, basically in the New Testament. Like his role was to kind of like help organize heaven and get things moving in that direction. Socrates was under no illusion of that at all. And so basically piggybacking on Andrew's point, Socrates, even if his guardian spirit said, don't run, so to speak, he was under no illusions that he was going to be like perfectly fine out the other side of this. There was still a doubt in his mind that maybe the afterlife could be pretty terrible. But then the other thing that Socrates said, which was interesting, is, hey, man, I'm 70 years old and I'm not going to change my ways. I'm too old for that. So even if I run to some other town, I'm just going to make a bunch of other people angry. And there's only so many times I can run before I just give out anyway. So we're just going to take a last stand here. Besides, I really like Athens. So here we go.
Well, yeah, the his discussion about death, as you mentioned, obviously the sort of there's a sort of like secular humanist new atheist reading of Greek philosophy that, well, they're using naturalistic explanations rather than myth to explain the way the world works. And certainly his idea of death as a kind of sleep is popular amongst secular humanists today. Just when you're dead, there's nothing else. But well, what's interesting when he talks about going to Hades and questioning all these people, he sort of on the one hand says that, the real judges of the afterlife, Minos and Rhadamanthus, are more just judges than you and would presumably, honor and respect me. And then also I could just, pester everyone else in the afterlife, which is interesting because I feel like that one would imagine that the spirits in the afterlife wouldn't be any more interested in being henpecked by Socrates than people were in life. But we sort of see that. I mean, there's a kind of flippantness about the defiance of Socrates here. He's like, well, whichever one happens, it's fine by me. And we sort of see this flippancy also when there's the vote on him. He says that it was there was a wide enough margin that not all of Athens was a lost cause. A lot of people voted on him to be innocent. But he says that, in that case, then you should just, feed me at the public expense because I'm more valuable than the athletes that win the Olympics. That's definitely not meant to endear yourself to the Athenian assembly. I think you have a lot to say about that, Logos.
Not particularly.
Right. Andrew, anything to comment about that there?
Yeah, I guess the other interesting thing to look at is how, like, basically a generation or two generations later, Athens treated like the death of Zeno of Citium, where he basically had this special tomb made and a bronze statue, and they gave him like the key to the city and considered him one of the treasures of the city. And it's sort of interesting that in some sense it seems like Socrates' legacy was only made truly good in a multi-generational way because he stayed and was executed, right? And otherwise, I mean, if he had gone into exile, it's very likely that his ideas would have been potentially eliminated, right? That's one possibility. Or another way to put it is the issues that he caused with like his students seem to have been transient compared to his legacy. And I think that's a really interesting thing to keep in mind as well, right? That even though we have this consensus of magistrates saying that you're screwing everything up, it turns out if you look 100 years later that no, they were wrong and he was right.
Well, to that point, we have through Socrates, Plato, and then Aristotle. Aristotle is famous for writing about the Athenian Constitution. I think Aristotle died in Athens and was generally quite favorable and supportive of the Athenian system of government. So through two generations, we see Socrates' legacy does give us someone like Aristotle, who was very much more in line with Athenian principles and supportive of them. And of course, much of what we know about ancient Athens is because Aristotle and his students wrote it down. So, indirectly, that's one of the gifts that Socrates does give to the Athenian state. But one of the things that's interesting is, especially at the beginning of the Apology, and we'll see this again in the Republic, is there's a great amount of antipathy to the poets. And I think in part, this is where we see that development in the Republic. So, at least with regards to the Apology, of course, Socrates is upset that they've slandered him in, like, say, the Clouds. But he also talks about how they're motivated by inspiration or a genie, the genius, which in this case would be some sort of spirit, familiar spirit, or daemon, which he claims to have as well. And he says that, but this inspiration isn't really based in truth or knowledge, which is why he's wiser than them. And I feel like what he's getting at is he's kind of upset that the poets are getting so much praise and support from the city, and he's not. Andrew, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, typically the way that I read it is that, and there's an example that I knew a college professor who liked, is he gave this modified description of one of the poems that, in the beginning, the gods made humanity, and humanity had 4 arms and 4 legs and was too powerful. And so they split them into two and made them male and female. And he modified it by saying it's not male or female, but sometimes male, male, sometimes female, female. And that explains, like, people that are gay and lesbian. And of course, because we live in a progressive society, all the students sort of nod along and are like, yeah, that makes perfect sense and explains things. And he then asks them, well, the Greeks actually didn't believe that. They believed this other thing. But you just nodded along and are going to remember that poem, probably use it to share with people, even though it's false, and it is aligned with what you think, right? And that's part of it. Is I feel like part of it is the poetry, and the poets provided sort of this psychological underpinning to beliefs that were either false or unjustified. And that, I think, is part of Socrates' hatred of the poets, is that they don't have this loyalty to wisdom or the truth, or even to their own ignorance, that he feels is sort of a necessary condition for human epistemic virtue.
Yeah, Logos, any comments on the poets?
Yeah, one thing that kind of struck me in the apology that Socrates used in describing the poets is they didn't really know what they were writing. They were kind of like soothsayers, or kind of like just channelers of information that they'd put on paper, and it sounded really, really interesting. And it's kind of bizarre, right? Because on the one hand, poets want this kind of authority to be thought of as like deep thinkers. But on the other hand, when they're asked to account for and have ultimate responsibility for what their text says, well, whatever, man, it's a poem. It can be interpreted many different ways. How does it make you feel, kind of a thing, right? And so they get this praise that Andrew's talking about, but it's not just that they have no responsibility to truth. It's just that they kind of have this built-in anti-fragility where whenever you try to like catch them on anything they've written, they could always just say, well, man, I just wrote how I felt. It just kind of words on the page, bro. I mean, if you don't feel good about it, that's just like on your thing, man. It's just a way you can pause and reflect. Never mind that on the base of these poems, these deepities and whatever's being written down, people are doing and behaving in all sorts of ways that can totally affect your life. It's not just whatever goes, man. People actually think these thoughts. You and I, Todd, have talked about some of the ways that people think about the world based on the fiction they see in the movies or on TV. And the poets were basically that past idea of that. And so you have people like Socrates and other philosophers living in this world where people are heavily influenced by these things, but they take the same lack of responsibility then as they would now. Whatever, man. It's just how you feel.
Yeah. One also interesting point in the cross examination is on the grounds of Socrates corrupting the youth intentionally or unintentionally. So they claim that he corrupted them intentionally. Socrates says that he would not have done it intentionally, because if he did it intentionally, then they would run the risk of harming him. Because if you harm someone else, then they will then harm other people. He did it unintentionally, and therefore the law would not have jurisdiction over judging somebody unintentionally. And furthermore, to the point that they refused to correct Socrates, they refused to engage him and lead him on the correct path. Now, what's interesting here is that last bit seems a little disingenuous, because if you, especially in the Republic, he's constantly engaging and being engaged by the leading citizens of Athens. And so when he says, well, you didn't instruct me on how to do things correctly, what he's probably saying is, well, not to my satisfaction, right? Because I can always poke holes in what you're saying. And even though you tried to correct me, you didn't. Or you could read it as him saying, well, you just never tried to correct me at all. But I guess really what's interesting, though, in this defense that he's giving is, one, does the law have grounds on which to judge somebody for unintentionally causing harm? I mean, I think it does. For example, we have the idea of manslaughter. You didn't intend to kill somebody, but because of negligence or something on your part, you did kill them. And so you would be punished, but not as like a first-degree murder. And then second of all, this is probably run in today with a lot of deconstructionist types, is even if they were quote unquote corrected, what would be a sufficient level of evidence to convince them to change their opinions? I mean, they might just go full Matt Dillahunty and say, I'm not convinced, bro. And if you just default to, I'm not convinced, bro, well, then there's no point in trying to engage with you to correct you. So to what extent is Socrates correct when he says that unintentional harm is not within the purview of the law? And to what extent was he being honest when he said, well, you didn't actually convince me, you didn't attempt to convince me of the errors of my way and the harm I was doing? Andrew.
Yeah, and I mean, basically, the standard that I know is it's negligence if you're not being reasonable, right? You're not using your faculties as is necessary and wise for the condition, right? And part of part of it is, if you use that definition, right, and you're a good Athenian, you have to affirm the Delphic oracle saying that Socrates is wise. And so if Socrates is wise and he's acting in accord with his wisdom, then you can't say that he's being negligent, right? Because then he's not really wise, or all these other things. And so that, I think, is part of the conundrum that they're running into.
Mm-hmm. Logos.
Yeah, the other problem too is going back to his students. Like Socrates, okay, Socrates may be acting unintentionally if he's just having a conversation with somebody. But when you look at say all the kids watching and running amok, so to speak, what are you going to make of those? And I guess the question is, like, it depends on what kind of laws Athens has with respect to corrupting the youth. Like, if you're actively, knowingly trying to teach them false things and like perjure them against the state, or you know, feed them falsities to make them hate their country or something, then okay, there's laws about that. We can do something about that. If there aren't laws about, or so then the question is, how much of that is Socrates' fault if he's just trying to have a conversation with somebody in the marketplace out and about like he's always done, and kids are kind of watching, poking around, and running off and doing what they do? It puts Socrates in kind of a conundrum where he doesn't charge. He just tries to teach people where they're at and meet them where they're at, marketplace, out and about doing stuff. He's not showing up to their house like some kind of a private tutor on call teaching them. And so the only way to ensure that he's kind of having these high level conversations in private, so they're not going to be abused by these kids, would be if Socrates, ironically enough, were like a private tutor. But if he were kind of like a private tutor, he'd be more like the sophists that the other accusations were accusing him of being, because there's one set of accusations where he was like an impious sophist, and there's another one where it's like he's corrupting the youth. So ways in which they'd have told him not to corrupt the youth would have had him acting more like a sophist, and vice versa. And that's, I think, a part of the bigger, wider conundrum of the dialogue as well. Yeah.
All right. Now, what's interesting is the running theme against the claim of impiety is that he's obedient to Apollo. Now, there is also a point where he says, "Well, I do believe in the gods, or I believe in spirits," but then Meletus says, "I don't believe in the gods," but that's crazy because the gods are spirits. So how can I be an atheist if I believe in spirits? But more specifically, though, he hones in on the fact that he obeys the oracle at Delphi. And he talks about being a gadfly, which is a part of the mission that the god gave him. And what we see here is, especially in light of the disaster of Alcibiades in the Sicilian campaign and the Peloponnesian War, we could argue that one of the problems that happened was Athens fell into groupthink. They kept on believing their own BS, telling themselves that they were the best, and all the information and intelligence that they gathered, they believed uncritically. So in a sense, what he's saying is that, well, look, this war that you guys lost, you lost because you fell into groupthink. And the reason why you need a gadfly, the reason why you need someone like me, is that I'm causing you to think and reevaluate, because the democracy is restored. But are we how are we going to avoid another oligarchy? How are we going to avoid another catastrophe for the Athenian state? We'll learn from the last war and not make those mistakes again. So you could sort of view this as a commentary on the last war and the dangers of groupthink. And I think really this is the ultimate point of the dialogue, which I think bears quoting. And this is right before he's condemned to death. Someone will say, "Yes, Socrates, but cannot you hold your tongue? And then you may go into a foreign city and no one will interfere with you. Now, I have great difficulty in making you understand my answer to this. For if I tell you that this would be disobedience to a divine command, and therefore that I cannot hold my tongue, you will not believe that I am serious. And if I say again that the greatest good of man is to daily converse about virtue, and all that concerning which you hear me, my examining myself and others, that the life which is unexamined is not worth living, that you will still less likely to believe." And I really think that's the key point of this whole dialogue, the idea that the unexamined life isn't worth living. And of course, the examination of life is for virtue and the good of the soul. And of course, when we get to the Republic, we're ready that the whole point of the Republic is a discursus on the soul. So, in a sense, Socrates does know something. We realize at the end, he does know that the greatest good is the good of the soul, and the way that you pursue the good of the soul is by investigating life. And I think ultimately that is the core and the takeaway of the apology. Andrew.
Yeah, I think that is sort of the key thing, and it hits on to what we talked in the Euthyphro dialogue last week, that Socrates likes to, especially as recorded by Plato, likes to make the negative space for an idea, and then maybe talk a little bit about the inside space, right? And part of what he knows when he says, "I know that I know nothing," is he's basically saying, I know what the limits of my knowledge are. And therefore, it's not that he doesn't know anything, he just knows that he knows nothing compared to what is out there to know, right? And that some of the things that he knows are really important, like what is the good of the soul.
Yeah, we'll go.
Yeah, one interesting part of the dialogue as well, very close to the part you were talking about, I think actually, is when Socrates says, more or less, uh, you'll all be doing yourselves a terrible disservice killing me. Um, this might have been after he was condemned to death as well. Yeah, killing me is actually going to make it worse for you, because while I might have been a gadfly and while I might have been like a thorn in your side, I, in some sense, want the best for you, right? I'm not actually out to harm you. But the people who would do what I do, that I've been basically keeping at bay, they're not going to be so nice. And it's kind of vague what Socrates might have meant there, but he might have meant like the trials of war. He might have meant like the gods in the afterlife. He might have meant like some of the more predatory philosophers, like the sophists or things like them. Um, it doesn't matter. Whatever you could put in that stead, I think what's really, really interesting about this point is that uh, the entire point of examining your life and stuff like that isn't just that it's a virtue, but also that it's a ward against the kind of things that can prey on you if you don't do it. Seems like a very Jordan Peterson type of thing to observe, but yeah, Socrates proto Jordan Peterson.
Now, what I find is interesting is what is actually left out of Plato's Apology. So, one thing that I would have expected Plato to say, or Socrates to say, depending on how much we want to take this as literal history, is make appeal to his service during the Peloponnesian War. So, for example, at the Battle of Potidea, he served in the Athenian army as they fought Corinth. So basically, what you would have expected him to say is, well, look, I was a loyal soldier. I fought against the Spartans and their allies throughout the whole war. And I find it very interesting that Plato doesn't even bring that up. Now, obviously, Plato has something uniquely in mind when he's making this is almost like a case for a certain kind of philosophy as such, and he's using Socrates as a vehicle for it, which fine. But I do find it interesting that he wouldn't even bring that up because, given the ancient classical world where military service was a sign of citizenship, you could say, well, look, of course I'm a good citizen. I put my body at the disposal of the state for the protection of the Commonwealth. And I think what that tells us is that the focus of Plato is very different. It's much more ethereal and abstract than say something more like practical and down to earth, like Aristotle and his Nicomachean Ethics of the Politics, which is about daily life and how to construct a political system, in life. And so I think one of the reasons why Plato doesn't even address this is because Plato's dealing with a much more abstract and foundational issue. What are your thoughts, Andrew?
Yeah, and you can definitely see that in contrast to like Xenophon's handling of the apology or of the memorabilia, right? And that basically, if you look at like the accounts in the memorabilia, it's very obvious that Socrates is not doing anything to or I mean he might be, but it seemed like if those are the typical actions that Socrates is taking, it's not in accord at all with these claims of being a sophist or corrupting the youth. I mean, he's giving like advice on how to manage a household, and that type of stuff. And I think you're exactly right that part of it is, and this is sort of the complexity, right, is that there's this historical context of Socrates as a real person on trial. And then there's also these layers of like philosophical points, both of Socrates and Plato's on top of it. And it's this sort of like indirect, almost Kierkegaardian method of teaching some of these principles.
Yeah, logos.
Yeah, something I've been thinking about all day as I've been kind of musing about this dialogue is if there is some broader philosophical point here. I mean, what is the point? Actually, something occurs to me. This might actually be a precursor to the Phaedo. I think what Socrates is trying to do here, or Plato rather, through Socrates is trying to do here, is associate the honest philosopher with the fact that people might hate them and want them dead rather than hearing what they have to say. And I think this is going to be cashed out a lot later. This might actually drive later Platonic dialogues that look at the soul and the certain aspects of the soul and answer the question. Well, like, look, if the examined life is so good for you, and if knowledge is so good for you, how come people don't follow through with it? How come people just lust and gamble and drink and don't think about the important things? And well, because the important things could cause you to die, either get killed by people that don't want to examine their lives or through other means. And this, in my view, might be the precursor to the famous Phaedo quote: "Philosophy is the art of dying and staying dead." And I think this is one of the one of the key important layers to it.
Well, you could also view, especially as in light of the end of the Apology, philosophy is sort of like the art of preparing for death. So in a certain way, when you look at classical history or even Eastern history, the way of the warrior is preparing for death, right? So Achilles knows he's going to die. He knows how he's going to die, but he chose an early death for the sake of glory and life. Bushido in Japan is the way of the warrior and is preparing for death. You could also argue that Plato is trying to argue that a philosopher should be held on par with a warrior because, like the way of the warrior, like at Achilles, he is preparing for death by the way he lives. But he's doing it in a very different way. Instead of the warrior training for death by building this sort of like stoic resignation to death and just, seizing the moment, in life, the philosopher is preparing almost for the next life. Because it does seem that even though Plato does talk about the idea of the dream death, as Platonic philosophy develops, it seems that Socrates' real belief was that there was an afterlife. Because the Platonists afterwards, believe that we become subsumed into the one with Neoplatonism. And so you could argue that philosophy is preparing one for death, rendering the philosopher a kind of a warrior, which would be why he would have such honors as eating at the state expense. Andrew.
Yeah, the translation I know, and it's really emphasized in Stoicism, is philosophy is the art of learning how to die, and it's very much this almost like martial virtue, right? That's emphasized, that you will deal with all the adversities of life, including death itself, in the same way that a brave warrior deals with the enemy, right? That you're not going to retreat or show cowardice, and you're going to engage in combat well under these very difficult trials. And I think that's a really interesting point, right? That is what he's articulating when he says that he deserves these honors from the Athenian state. And the other thing is, he actually wasn't Socrates like a decorated war hero prior to his philosophical career?
Yeah, he fought at the Battle of Potidæa and helped win a victory for the Athenians against Corinth.
Yeah, so I think that he looked at that as a part of his life and not something that he like retired or compartmentalized. And I think that's a key insight.
Yeah, Logos?
I don't think I'd have too much to add to this.
All right. Well, we're nearing, I think, the end. One thing that I'd like to say is if we look at the trial of Socrates as a series of real events that happened, I think oftentimes the death of Socrates is mediated through Plato because people read about it in philosophy. I think given the nature of Alcibiades, the nature of Critias, Critias was a student of Plato as is described in the Critias dialogue, and Alcibiades was his lover. The idea that he really had this reputation of breeding a sort of brood of traitors does give the Athenians a better case than you would otherwise think if you just read Plato's dialogue. But if you read Plato's dialogue of the Apology and view it as making this broader point about who a philosopher is, what a philosopher ought to do, whether or not we can say that's a one-to-one matchup with Socrates, I think that it's a really powerful account. It's the idea that you should speak truth to power, even if it means you get killed. In which case, we can also see that the poets do align with Socrates in some regard. For example, in the Antigone, she speaks truth to power and is also killed for it. So it's not like the poets are completely dishonest in this regard. And then, of course, it it culminates in the idea that you examine your life to prepare your soul for death. And that, I think, is one of the most powerful legacies for Western philosophy since. Andrew.
Yeah, and the thing that we have to sort of emphasize is, I think that self-examination is closer to sort of the metanoia or repentance of the Christian tradition and even Jewish tradition than it is of sort of this New Age woo-woo, know what your preferences are thing. And I think that's a really key part of why there is sort of a resonance between Greek philosophy and the Hebrew and Christian religions. Or Judeo-Christian, or however you want to put it, is that idea of sort of reflective repentance to prepare oneself for one's final ends.
Right. Logos, final thoughts.
Yeah, as I've read this, I've never considered the Apology one of my favorite Platonic dialogues because, on one level, it seems to lack a lot of meat. I can read through Euthyphro and get something new each time I read it. I'm like, oh, that's an interesting argument I never catched or never caught before. And I can do so similarly with the Phaedo and other dialogues. But the Apology seems kind of cut and dry. And so I've been trying to figure out like how to generalize the themes from it. Is it a theme about the afterlife and philosophy, as you were talking about? Is it a commentary on people? So one of the first things I think of with the Apology immediately is John Stuart Mill, because he's famous in his On Liberty essay for saying he never would have killed Socrates. But if you read his On Utilitarianism book, he straight up says that um, the only people who can judge something are those who've experienced something, experienced its negation, and if there's a stalemate there, like there's disagreement, the majority vote wins. Well, you had these Athenian people that ostensibly experienced life with and without Socrates in various degrees. There was a stalemate on whether Socrates should or shouldn't live, and they all voted, and Socrates died. So how can Mill really say what he says in On Liberty when he never actually experienced Socrates? The Athenians did. So this could be a broader discussion about utilitarianism too. Like, is there limits to is there limits to what people should vote on? Even if democracy is a good thing, is there limits to what democracy should be able to vote on? Because one of the things I keep going back to is when Socrates says, like, okay, killing me may seem good for you now, but it's going to do worse for you later. You're killing the gadfly who's going to help you. So should things that could actually undermine society in the way that Socrates' death would undermine society be left to a democratic vote? That's an interesting question, and it might be the basis for how we get like constitutional rights and stuff. There's certain things that the government just won't prosecute people for, kill people for, so on. There's some things that are just out of the hands of the populace because in haste or anger or something, they can always vote to undermine this thing. And so I don't know. In conclusion, there's some interesting metaphysical questions here, some interesting political science questions here. It's not really clear where to put this dialogue as far as like what exactly is the object of commentary, but I don't know. Maybe the broadness is the point of it. I don't know what else to say.
All right. Well, again, thanks again, Logos and Andrew. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.